Dr. Evelyn Carson, a talented and compassionate physician, once found her calling under the guidance of Dr. Henry Whitmore, a brilliant mentor whose belief in her changed the course of her life. Now, years later, Whitmore lies in a hospital bed under Evelyn's care, frail and fading, the weight of time and illness drawing him closer to his final days. But as Evelyn fights to save the man who once shaped her career, a shattering truth emerges. Whitmore's past hides a connection to a group with ties to racial discrimination. This revelation sends Evelyn spiraling into anger, confusion, and disbelief. How can she reconcile the man who believed in her potential with the man who stayed silent in the face of injustice? Caught between her professional duty and her personal disillusionment, Evelyn faces the greatest challenge of her life, not just as a doctor, but as a person who must decide how to honor the good while confronting the truth of the flawed. What final words will Whitmore leave behind? Will they bring redemption, regret, or only reinforce Evelyn's sense of betrayal? And more importantly, how will Evelyn choose to carry forward the legacy that's now been placed in her hands? Dr. Evelyn Carson's apartment was small, but she had always found solace in its simplicity. The beige walls were lined with photos of family her parents, strong and smiling, despite the weight of their sacrifices. A small bookshelf stood by her window, filled with medical textbooks, journals, and a few novels she never had time to finish. The light from the street lamp outside poured through the blinds, casting long shadows across the worn wooden floor. She stood in front of her lone mirror, adjusting the collar of her white coat. The faint hum of early morning traffic filtered through the thin walls. A single framed diploma hung in her bedroom, a constant reminder of her journey, a journey that had been long, grueling, and punctuated by moments of doubt. But here she was, a physician at one of the largest hospitals in the city, a doctor who had earned her place. Yet some days, Evelyn still felt the pressure of proving herself. She checked her watch, 5:45 a.m. It was time to leave. Outside, the city was still waking up. The sidewalks were damp with last night's rain, and the cool air carried the faint smell of coffee from a nearby corner cart. Evelyn walked briskly toward the train station, her bag slung over her shoulder. She thought about her schedule for the day rounds in the ICU, followed by back-to-back consultations. It would be another 14-hour shift, another day spent caring for others while pushing aside her own exhaustion. The hospital loomed large as she approached, gray, towering, and alive with movement. Ambulances pulled up to the emergency bay, nurses buzzed in and out of the doors, and orderlies shuffled equipment through the hallways. Evelyn's badge clipped against her coat as she entered, her shoes tapping the tile floor with practiced confidence. As she passed through the main corridor, familiar faces greeted her. Some nodded, others offered quiet smiles. Evelyn returned them, though her mind was already elsewhere. She barely noticed Dr. Mark Patterson, a tall, lanky physician with an ever-present cup of coffee, waving her down. "Evelyn," Mark called, hurrying to catch up. "Did you hear? Dr. Whitmore is being admitted." Evelyn stopped. "Dr. Henry Whitmore?" "Yes. Critical condition. They brought him in late last night." The name struck her like a stone. Dr. Henry Whitmore, her Dr. Whitmore. The man who had mentored her during her residency. The man who had guided her through some of the darkest moments of her early career. Whitmore was a legend in the medical community, revered for his skill, his calm under pressure, and his dedication to teaching. For Evelyn, his influence had been personal. He had believed in her when others had not. In the early days of her residency, when some colleagues had treated her with thinly veiled skepticism, Whitmore had been the one to challenge her and push her to be better. He had stood by her side in the operating room, his voice steady, his hand firm on her shoulder as she stitched her first wound. "He is in the ICU," Mark said softly, noticing Evelyn's silence. "They are putting you on his case." Evelyn's heart sank. She forced herself to nod, her face unreadable. "All right, I will take a look." The ICU was a world of its own, a hushed, sterile space where the line between life and death felt agonizingly thin. Machines beeped softly, tubes and wires snaked around beds, and doctors moved with a quiet urgency. Evelyn stood just inside the doorway, scanning the room until her eyes landed on the bed in the far corner. Dr. Henry Whitmore lay there, frail and pale, hooked up to a ventilator. His once imposing frame had withered, his broad shoulders now hunched beneath the hospital gown. His skin was gray, his breathing shallow. It was hard to reconcile this image with the man she had known, the man who had towered over the surgical table with unwavering confidence. She approached the bed cautiously, her chest tight. For a moment, she hesitated, her hand resting on the cold metal of the bed rail. She studied his face, searching for some flicker of recognition. His eyelids fluttered, and his gaze met hers, weak but clear. "Dr. Whitmore," she said softly. He blinked slowly, and his lips curved into the faintest of smiles. "Evelyn," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Look at you, all grown up." Evelyn swallowed the lump in her throat. "We are going to take care of you?" He nodded weakly. "Good hands," he murmured, before his eyes drifted shut. Evelyn watched him for a moment longer, before stepping back. She turned her attention to the chart at the foot of his bed, scanning the details. Severe pneumonia, complicated by underlying heart disease. It was bad, worse than she had expected. His age and weakened condition left little room for optimism. Mark appeared beside her, holding a fresh cup of coffee. "Tough case." Evelyn sighed, setting the chart down. "He was always the strong one. It is hard to see him like this." Mark studied her carefully. "You okay?" "I will be," Evelyn replied, though she was not sure it was true. The day passed in a blur of patient rounds and tense decisions. Evelyn juggled emergencies and administrative tasks, but her thoughts kept returning to Dr. Whitmore. She could not shake the feeling of unease that lingered in her chest. Seeing him so weak had stirred something in her gratitude, certainly, but also a strange sense of guilt. She had not spoken to him in years, not since the day she completed her residency and moved on to a different hospital. Their parting had been briefing, polite, a simple handshake and words of thanks. She had always assumed she would see him again. By evening, Evelyn was drained. She sat alone in the break room, staring into a cup of lukewarm tea. The quiet hum of the hospital surrounded her. It was in these rare moments of stillness that the weight of her responsibilities caught up to her. She thought of her parents, who had worked tirelessly to support her dreams. She thought of the people who had doubted her, who had dismissed her because of the color of her skin or the softness of her voice. And she thought of Whitmore, who had been the first to tell her, "You have what it takes." Her phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a message from her younger brother, David, asking if she was coming home for their mother's birthday next week. Evelyn smiled faintly. Her family was her anchor. They were her reminder of who she was and why she had fought so hard to be here. The door to the break room creaked open, and Nurse Carla Simmons entered. Carla was a tall woman with a gentle demeanor and a knack for comforting even the most hardened doctors. She set a fresh cup of coffee in front of Evelyn without a word. Evelyn looked up, startled. "You did not have to." "You looked like you needed it," Carla said simply. She pulled up a chair and sat across from her. "Long day?" Evelyn nodded. "Dr. Whitmore's case. It is personal." Carla's expression softened. "He meant a lot to you, huh?" "He did," Evelyn admitted. "He believed in me when no one else did. I owe him more than I can say." Carla nodded thoughtfully. "It is hard when we see the people who shaped us start to fade. It makes you think about what matters, about the kind of legacy you want to leave behind." Evelyn looked down at the steaming coffee in her hands. The unexpected kindness of Carla's words brought an ache to her chest. Here was someone who had noticed her struggle, who had taken the time to offer a moment of comfort. "Thank you," Evelyn said quietly. Carla smiled. "We all need someone to look out for us every now and then." As Evelyn sat there, she felt a small shift within her, a resolve to face whatever lay ahead, with the same compassion and strength she had always admired in Whitmore. She would fight for him, just as he had once fought for her. That night, as Evelyn walked back to her apartment, she felt the weight on her shoulders lighten just a little. The city lights glowed around her, and for the first time in days, she allowed herself to breathe. She could not change the past, but she could honor the people who had shaped her by doing what she did best, healing. As she unlocked her apartment door and stepped inside, she glanced at the framed diploma on the wall. It was not just a piece of paper, it was a testament to perseverance, to kindness, and to the belief that even the hardest roads could lead to something good. Tomorrow would be another day, and she would be ready for it. The morning sun slipped through Evelyn's thin curtains, but the light felt dull to her. She sat on the edge of her bed, staring at her phone. The hospital had called Dr. Whitmore's condition had worsened overnight. Evelyn knew this day would come eventually, yet the news still landed like a fist to her chest. Forcing herself up, she moved to her tiny kitchen. It was quiet, except for the faint hum of her refrigerator. She brewed coffee out of habit, but hardly tasted it. Her apartment felt stifling, suffocating in its stillness. There was something about seeing Dr. Whitmore, frail and fading, that had unsettled her deeply. Evelyn thought of the man she had once admired. During her residency, Dr. Whitmore had been the kind of mentor who seemed larger than life. Tall, silver-haired, and commanding, he had exuded the confidence of someone who knew exactly what to do in the most chaotic of situations. Patients trusted him. Students feared and revered him. For Evelyn, he had been more than just a teacher. He had been a source of strength. She could still hear his voice in the back of her mind. "Slow your hands, Evelyn. Good surgeons are calm surgeons." Or, on days when doubt gnawed at her, "Remember, skill is earned. You have to believe you belong here before anyone else will." Now that voice belonged to someone lying in a hospital bed, his body betraying him bit by bit. By the time Evelyn arrived at the hospital, her mask of composure was back in place. She walked with brisk purpose, nodding politely to colleagues as she passed. In the ICU, she found Nurse Carla Simmons adjusting an IV at Dr. Whitmore's bedside. "How is he?" Evelyn asked softly. Carla sighed, smoothing down the blanket around Whitmore's thin frame. "Not great. His oxygen levels dropped again early this morning. We stabilized him, but he's slipping fast." Evelyn stepped closer to the bed. Whitmore's skin was ashen, and his breathing was slow, almost labored, the ventilator hissing softly. His eyes flickered open at the sound of her voice, and Evelyn felt her throat tighten. "Dr. Whitmore," she said, forcing calm into her tone. "It's me, Evelyn. How are you feeling?" His pale blue eyes settled on her face. For a moment, something passed between them, recognition, perhaps, or gratitude. His lips moved slightly, but his voice was barely a whisper. "You came back," he said weakly. Evelyn nodded. "I am here. We are going to do everything we can to help you." Whitmore's hand, frail and trembling, twitched against the blanket. Evelyn reached out and gave it a light squeeze. She hated the way it felt so fragile, so unlike the man who had once guided her. "Good hands," he murmured again, before his eyes drifted shut. Evelyn turned to Carla, who watched her with a quiet understanding. "I will stay on his case," Evelyn said. "Let me know the moment anything changes." Carla gave her a reassuring pat on the arm. "You've got this, Dr. Carson." The rest of Evelyn's morning was consumed by rounds and consults, but her mind remained clouded. At lunch, she sat in the break room again, turning over thoughts like stones in her mind. Mark Patterson strolled in, his usual cup of coffee in hand. "You look like you're about to solve a mystery." Evelyn glanced up with a faint smile. "Not a mystery, just thinking." About Whitmore? She nodded. It's hard seeing him like this. He was a giant in my life, Mark. And now he's human. Mark finished gently, sitting across from her. It's always tough when our heroes lose their shine. It reminds us they're not invincible. Evelyn stared into her untouched food. I owe him so much. He believed in me when no one else did. Mark sipped his coffee, then said carefully, People are complicated, Evelyn. We see their best and their worst. What matters is what they leave behind, right? Evelyn frowned, turning his words over in her mind. Maybe, she replied softly. Later that afternoon, Evelyn returned to Whitmore's room. This time she wasn't alone. An older man, clearly in his 60s, stood by the bed. He wore a crisp suit and had the kind of stern face that betrayed little emotion. Who are you? Evelyn asked, keeping her voice polite. The man glanced at her, his eyes sharp. I'm Edward Whitmore, Henry's younger brother. Evelyn straightened, surprised. I see. Edward turned back to Henry, his jaw tight. So this is how it ends, he said quietly. The great Dr. Henry Whitmore. I suppose no one escapes time, do they? Evelyn felt a flicker of discomfort. Edward's tone was cold, devoid of the warmth she would expect from family. Before she could respond, he turned to leave, brushing past her without another word. Evelyn's unease lingered long after Edward had gone. Something about him felt off. She turned her attention back to Whitmore, watching him as he lay still, his breaths ragged and uneven. For a fleeting moment, she wondered what kind of life he had lived outside of the hospital walls. Did he have regrets? Was he proud of his legacy? Who are you really, Dr. Whitmore? The sun had set by the time Evelyn finished her shift. She sat in her office, the room illuminated by the dim light of her desk lamp. Patient charts were scattered across her desk, but her mind was elsewhere. She picked up an old notebook she had kept during her residency, half medical notes, half personal reflections. Flipping through the worn pages, she found a scribbled quote. Medicine is not just science, it's compassion. It's listening. It's healing hearts as much as bodies. Dr. Henry Whitmore. She traced the words with her fingertip, her heart aching. It was strange how a single person could leave such an imprint on one's life. Yet beneath her admiration, a quiet unease lingered. Edward Whitmore's demeanor had unsettled her, though she couldn't quite place why. Just then, a knock at the door startled her. Evelyn? It was Carla. She peeked inside, her face lined with concern. You heading home any time soon? Evelyn forced a smile. In a minute. Carla walked in and sat on the corner of Evelyn's desk. You know, you don't have to carry the whole hospital on your shoulders. I'm fine, Evelyn said automatically. You're not, Carla replied softly. I've seen that look before. You're worried about him. Evelyn sighed, letting her guard slip. He's not just another patient, Carla. I don't know how to describe it. He was the first person to see me as a doctor, not just another face. And now, Carla placed a warm hand on her shoulder. You do what you always do, Evelyn. You show up. You fight for him. And when the time comes, you let yourself feel what you need to feel. Evelyn looked at her, a mix of gratitude and weariness in her eyes. Carla's kindness was steady and unshakable, a quiet reassurance that Evelyn hadn't known she needed. Thank you, Evelyn murmured. Any time, Carla said with a small smile. Now go home and get some rest. Tomorrow's another day. Evelyn stepped out of the hospital into the crisp night air, her thoughts still heavy. The streets were quieter now, the hum of the city softer under the blanket of darkness. As she walked toward the train station, she glanced up at the sky. Her father had once told her that the stars always seemed brightest on the hardest nights. As a child, she'd never understood what he meant, but now, as the pinpricks of light glittered above, she found a strange comfort in the thought. One step at a time, she told herself. You just keep going. And so she did. The morning was gray, the clouds hanging low like a heavy curtain over the city skyline. Rain pattered softly against the hospital windows as Evelyn moved through her rounds. Her mind was sharper today, the fatigue of yesterday replaced with quiet resolve. "Good morning, Dr. Carson," a nurse greeted as she passed by. Evelyn nodded warmly. "Morning, Mia." She had decided that no matter how complicated her emotions were regarding Dr. Whitmore, she would keep her focus on her duty. That was what he had taught her. After all, a good doctor never lets emotion cloud their judgment. His words rang in her ears as she walked back into the ICU. Dr. Whitmore was stable, though barely. His breaths were still assisted by the ventilator, and his frailty seemed to deepen by the hour. Evelyn had spent most of the last evening poring over his scans and charts, searching for anything they might have missed. But his body was failing, worn down by years of silent battles against illness and age. As she stood by his bed now, adjusting the IV line, she noticed his lips moving slightly, though no sound escaped. "What is it?" Evelyn leaned closer. "Dr. Whitmore?" His eyelids fluttered, but he did not wake. It was as if he were trapped between consciousness and sleep, his mind lingering on words left unsaid. Evelyn straightened, her heart aching at how fragile he looked. During her lunch break, Evelyn sat in the hospital library, her tray untouched as she flipped through old patient files, looking for answers. Part of her knew it was futile. There was little she could do to reverse years of accumulated damage, but searching gave her something to focus on. "Still at it, huh?" Mark Patterson dropped into the seat across from her, setting down his own tray with an exaggerated thud. Evelyn looked up, half smiling. "You know me. I cannot leave a puzzle unsolved." Mark studied her for a moment, a knowing glint in his eyes. "It's not just about solving the puzzle, is it? It's him. It's Whitmore." Evelyn sighed. "I owe him, Mark. He gave me so much, and now I have to be the one to fight for him." Mark leaned back, twirling his pen between his fingers. "You can only do so much, Ev. You're not a miracle worker." "I know," Evelyn replied, though her tone suggested otherwise. She would not give up, not yet. Mark shifted the conversation. "You know, I've heard a few whispers about Dr. Whitmore lately." Evelyn frowned. "What whispers?" "Nothing solid," Mark said quickly. "Just old stories from staff who have been here longer. You know how rumors go." Evelyn tilted her head, curiosity flickering in her chest. "What kind of stories?" Mark hesitated, clearly unsure if he should continue. Finally, he shrugged. "Something about his past connections he had before his reputation took off. Associations he wasn't proud of." Evelyn's brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" Mark shook his head. "Forget it. It's probably just gossips. You know how hospitals are." But Evelyn couldn't forget it. The words lingered in her mind long after Mark had left the table. Later that afternoon, Evelyn was helping Nurse Carla organize some supplies in a back storage room when an old box caught her attention. It was tucked on the top shelf, dusty and forgotten, marked Archive, 1980-1990. "What's in that?" Evelyn asked absently as Carla handed her a clipboard. Carla glanced up, squinting at the box. "Oh, just old hospital records. Paperwork from way back when. A lot of it belonged to Whitmore before everything went digital." Evelyn's heartbeat quickened. "Dr. Whitmore?" "Yeah," Carla said, wiping her hands on her scrubs. "He used to keep meticulous files. That man loved his records." Something about the box tugged at Evelyn's curiosity. "Do you mind if I look through it?" Carla shrugged. "Be my guest. Just don't get lost in the paperwork. You've got patients waiting." Evelyn pulled the box down carefully and set it on the table. Her hands brushed against the faded cardboard before she opened it, the scent of old paper rising to meet her. Inside were stacks of files, notes, and faded photographs. Most of it was harmless early drafts of hospital policies, patient logs, correspondence between doctors, and then, buried near the bottom, Evelyn's hand froze over a yellowed newspaper clipping. The headline struck her like a thunderclap: Local Medical Association linked to discriminatory group. Her eyes darted over the words, her breath caught in her throat. The article mentioned an organization from decades earlier, a group known for promoting exclusionary practices against black professionals in medicine. Its tone was scandalized, condemning those who were quiet supporters of the group without publicly acknowledging their membership. Near the bottom of the article, her gaze landed on a single name: Dr. Henry Whitmore. The paper trembled in her hands. "No," she whispered under her breath, as if saying it aloud would make it untrue. She read the paragraph again, each word cutting deeper than the last. The man who had believed in her, who had stood beside her when no one else would, had once been tied to a group that worked to exclude people like her. She felt sick. Her knees weakened, and she sank onto the nearest chair. The world around her seemed to blur. It has to be a mistake, she thought. Maybe he didn't know what the group stood for. Maybe he. But another part of her, the part that had been shaped by years of fighting for her place in the world, whispered, what if he did know? Her mind spun with memories of Whitmore, his steady guidance, his encouragement. She thought of the way he had shielded her from harsh comments during her residency, how he had lifted her up when others tried to tear her down. How could that man have once been part of something so ugly? "Dr. Carson?" Carla's voice startled her from her thoughts. Evelyn looked up sharply, quickly tucking the clipping back into the box. I'm fine," she said, though her voice was hollow. "Just an old article. Nothing important." Carla nodded, unconvinced. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Evelyn forced herself to stand, her legs unsteady beneath her. "I'm fine," she repeated, more firmly this time. "I just remembered I have rounds to finish." She left the room quickly, the weight of the discovery pressing on her like a stone. The rest of the day passed in a haze. Evelyn moved through her tasks mechanically, her thoughts a storm she couldn't quiet. She avoided Whitmore's room, unable to look at him without feeling the sting of betrayal. That night, back in her apartment, she sat on her bed with the newspaper clippings spread out before her. The dim lamp cast a faint glow on the yellowed paper, the words staring back at her like an accusation. Her emotions tangled together: anger, hurt, confusion. She thought of her parents, who had worked twice as hard for half as much, who had faced doors slammed in their faces because of their skin. And then she thought of Whitmore, the man who had held the door open for her. Who was he, she wondered? A hero or a hypocrite? A man who changed, or a man who hid his past? The silence of her apartment offered no answers. Evelyn rested her head in her hands, tears stinging her eyes. She thought of her father's words, ones he often said when life was unfair. "You don't get to choose how others see you. You only get to choose who you are." Evelyn wiped her face and looked at the clipping one last time before folding it carefully. The truth had shaken her, but it was not the end. Tomorrow, she would face Whitmore. She needed answers. The following morning arrived heavy with an unshakable weight in Evelyn's chest. The newspaper clipping sat neatly folded on her nightstand, as though daring her to look at it again. Evelyn had barely slept. Every time she closed her eyes, memories of Dr. Whitmore's guidance collided with the harsh words of that article. Who was he, really? The thought gnawed at her, leaving no room for peace. Outside, the city's rhythm continued without pause. Evelyn watched as the light crept into her apartment, chasing the shadows to the corners of the room. Time to go, she told herself. But the thought of facing Whitmore again made her stomach turn. At the hospital, the sterile scent of antiseptic and the rhythmic beeping of machines felt sharper today, every sound amplified. Evelyn moved through her morning rounds with practiced precision, her movements calm and steady on the surface. but beneath her composure, a storm brewed. "Dr. Carson," Nurse Carla called as Evelyn emerged from a patient's room. "Dr. Whitmore's stats are holding steady, but his oxygen levels dipped again an hour ago. He's asking for you." Evelyn paused, her hand tightening around the clipboard she held. "He's asking for me." "All right," she said, her voice betraying none of the turmoil she felt. "I'll see him now." Carla tilted her head, her eyes searching Evelyn's face. "You sure you're okay?" "I'm fine," Evelyn replied with a small smile. She had grown so good at that lie, it almost sounded true. Whitmore's room felt colder today, the hum of the ventilator louder than before. Evelyn stood at the threshold for a moment, looking at the man who had shaped so much of her life. His frail frame lay motionless, but his eyes were open, tired but alert. "Evelyn!" Whitmore rasped, his voice barely audible. She moved to his side, checking the monitor reflexively. "You're awake," she said softly. Whitmore gave the faintest nod. "You have always been persistent. I knew you'd come." Her chest tightened. Evelyn looked at his pale face, the same face that had once beamed with pride when she graduated her residency. It was hard to reconcile this man with what she had found. "I want to help you," she said, her voice steady, "but you're not improving. We need to talk about options for your care." Whitmore's gaze softened. "I trust you." Those words, "I trust you," struck Evelyn harder than she expected. She swallowed the lump in her throat, pulling a stool closer to sit by his bedside. For a moment, the room was silent, except for the sounds of machines keeping Whitmore tethered to life. Finally, Evelyn spoke. "I need to ask you something." Whitmore's head turned slightly toward her, his pale blue eyes watching her closely. "Years ago," Evelyn began carefully, "you taught me that integrity is everything. That being a good doctor means being a good person." He gave the faintest nod, though his face remained unreadable. Evelyn hesitated, her heart pounding in her chest. "Then why," she said softly, "is your name tied to a group that stood for exclusion? A group that kept people like me, like my parents, from opportunities they deserved?" The question hung in the air like a blade. Whitmore's face, which had been calm, grew taut. His lips parted slightly, as if to speak, but for a long moment, no sound came. Evelyn pressed on, her voice sharper now. "Did you know what they stood for? Did you agree with them?" The silence stretched unbearably. Finally, Whitmore's voice broke through, hoarse and faint. "I was young." He paused to catch his breath. "Stupid. When I first joined, I thought it was just a group of doctors, a place to belong." Evelyn's chest tightened, her mind racing. "But you stayed," she said. "You stayed long enough for your name to be written in that article." Whitmore's eyelids flickered. His expression was pained not from illness, but from something deeper. "I didn't stay forever," he whispered. "Once I understood what they really were, I walked away." "Why didn't you say anything?" Evelyn demanded, her voice trembling. "Why didn't you speak out? People trusted you. I trusted you." Whitmore turned his face toward her, his pale blue eyes dull with age and regret. "It was easier to stay silent," he said. "I was a coward, Evelyn." The word coward hung in the air, sharp and ugly. Evelyn felt her hands tremble. A coward. That was not the Henry Whitmore she had known. That was not the man who had believed in her, who had lifted her up when she had felt invisible. And yet, here he was, telling her the truth. Evelyn's voice dropped to a whisper. "You believed in me. You fought for me when no one else would. How do I reconcile that with this?" Whitmore closed his eyes. "I spent years trying to make up for it, to help people, like you. But guilt never leaves." The honesty in his words hit Evelyn like a wave. She stood slowly, unable to look at him. "I need some air," she muttered before leaving the room. Evelyn walked quickly down the hallway, her breath coming in short gasps. She felt untethered, her emotions warring with one another. He was a coward, she thought bitterly. And yet, another voice whispered, he changed. Didn't he? She found herself outside in the small courtyard of the hospital, where a few benches sat under sprawling oak trees. The rain had stopped, but the sky remained overcast, the clouds swirling like the thoughts in her head. Evelyn sat heavily on a bench, burying her face in her hands. For the first time in years, she felt like that young intern again, the one who had to prove herself, who carried the weight of expectations and disappointments. Whitmore had been her anchor back then, and now that anchor felt tainted. "Dr. Carson?" Evelyn looked up, startled. It was Nurse Carla, her steady presence a welcome sight. Carla sat beside her without waiting for an invitation, her calm demeanor settling the tension in the air. "You okay?" Carla asked quietly. Evelyn exhaled slowly. "I don't know." Carla nodded as if she understood perfectly. "It's hard when people we look up to let us down." Evelyn looked at her hands. He said he was a coward, that he didn't speak up because it was easier to stay silent. Carla sighed, shaking her head. "We all have choices, Evelyn. Some people make the wrong ones. But you get to decide what you do with this." Evelyn looked at her, frowning. "What do you mean?" Carla smiled faintly. "You are not Henry Whitmore. His mistakes don't define you. You get to decide what kind of doctor and what kind of person you want to be." The words settled in Evelyn's chest like a stone, but not an unwelcome one. She nodded slowly, her mind clearer than it had been all morning. "Thank you," she said quietly. Carla patted her shoulder gently. "Come on, there's still work to do." Evelyn stood, her back straightening. She wasn't sure if she could forgive Whitmore, not yet, but Carla was right. She could choose. As she re-entered the hospital, the storm in her mind began to calm. The soft murmur of the ICU followed Evelyn like a shadow as she returned to her duties. Her conversation with Dr. Whitmore lingered, unshakable in her mind. "I was a coward." Those words had lodged themselves deep within her, settling alongside her anger and disappointment. Evelyn's steps were purposeful, but her thoughts churned. She couldn't look at Whitmore the same way now, but the image of him, a frail, aging man, full of regret, haunted her. He was no longer the towering figure who had guided her hands through her first sutures. He was flawed, human, and painfully small against the weight of his past. The hallway lights buzzed softly as she walked toward the break room, hoping for a moment of solitude. Her body felt heavy with exhaustion, not the kind cured by sleep, but the kind that settles when life demands more answers than it gives. As Evelyn pushed open the break room door, she nearly collided with Dr. Mark Patterson. He held 2 cups of coffee, his expression one of mild amusement. "Whoa there," Mark said, stepping back to avoid spilling the drinks. "You in a hurry to escape, or are you just aiming to take me out?" Evelyn forced a small smile. "I could use an escape right about now." Mark's brow furrowed as he handed her one of the cups. "Here, you look like you need this more than I do." Evelyn blinked, caught off guard. "Thank you," she said softly. Mark shrugged as they sat at the small table in the corner. "You're not yourself today, Ev. Talk to me." She hesitated, cradling the warmth of the cup between her hands. Mark had a way of prying answers out of her without ever pushing too hard. He was good at reading people, a skill she often envied. "I found out something about Whitmore," she admitted finally. "Something I can't unsee." Mark's expression softened, and he leaned back in his chair. "The whispers?" Evelyn nodded. "They're true." He admitted it. For a moment, Mark said nothing. He let her words settle, as if weighing his own response carefully. "And now you don't know what to do with it." Evelyn looked down into her coffee. "How can I?" He helped me become who I am today, Mark. He believed in me. But now, knowing he was part of something so hateful, it feels like everything he stood for was a lie. Mark tapped his fingers lightly on the table, thoughtful. I get it. It's hard when someone you admire lets you down. But Whitmore isn't just one moment in his life, Evelyn. People are complicated. They can be good to some and terrible to others. Doesn't mean what he did for you wasn't real. Evelyn frowned. But how do I reconcile that? How do I forgive him for being part of something that hurt people like me? You don't have to forgive him, Mark said simply. Not right away, maybe not ever, but you can choose what to do with it. You can let it pull you down, or you can learn from it. Evelyn studied him, surprised by the clarity in his words. Mark often joked and teased, but when it mattered, he always managed to cut straight to the heart of things. You sound like my father, she said quietly. Mark grinned. Your dad must be a smart guy. Evelyn shook her head, but a small smile tugged at her lips. Thanks, Mark. Really? Any time, he replied, his voice softer now. And for what it's worth, you're doing exactly what Whitmore taught you to do, showing up. Even when it's hard. Evelyn sipped her coffee, letting the words sink in. She didn't have all the answers, but Mark was right. She was still here, still doing her job, even as everything she thought she knew began to crack apart. That afternoon, Evelyn walked back into Dr. Whitmore's room. The ventilator still hissed softly, and Whitmore's skin looked ashen against the stark white sheets. He was sleeping, his chest rising and falling with labored breaths. Evelyn pulled up a stool and sat beside him. For a long while, she simply watched him, studying the man she thought she had known so well. She wanted to be angry, to shout at him for his silence, for the damage he might have allowed, but she couldn't bring herself to do it. There was something about seeing him now, so vulnerable and fragile, that made her anger flicker like a candle in the wind. You're a coward, her mind whispered again, but the thought felt less sharp than before. I don't know how to forgive you, she murmured softly, knowing he couldn't hear her. But I'm still here, and I'm going to fight for you, the same way you fought for me. Her words lingered in the air, heavy but honest. As Evelyn left Whitmore's room, she spotted Nurse Carla down the hallway, checking vitals at a patient's bed. Carla glanced up and caught Evelyn's gaze, offering a small smile. Evelyn returned it faintly, then turned toward her next task. Dr. Carson! The voice startled her. Evelyn turned to see a young man standing by the nurse's station, holding the hand of a little boy no older than 6. The man looked familiar, but Evelyn couldn't quite place him. I don't know if you remember me, the man said, stepping closer. My name's Andre Peterson. My son, Jamie, was in here last year. He had pneumonia. You saved his life. Recognition hit her, and Evelyn smiled faintly. Of course, I remember Jamie. How is he doing now? The little boy peeked out from behind his father's leg, his brown eyes wide with curiosity. He's doing great, Andre said. I just wanted to say thank you. You took care of us when we were terrified, and you never made us feel like we didn't matter. Evelyn blinked, surprised by the emotion in his voice. I was just doing my job. Andre shook his head firmly. No, Dr. Carson. You did more than that. You showed us kindness when we needed it most. You saved my boy's life. Evelyn looked down at Jamie, who offered her a shy smile. Thank you for saying that, she said quietly. People like you change the world, Andre said, his voice steady. One patient at a time. The words struck something deep within Evelyn. She felt a warmth spread in her chest, a reminder of why she did this work, of why she had fought so hard to get here. Take care of that little boy, she said, smiling at Andre. Always, Andre replied. He took Jamie's hand, and they disappeared down the hallway, leaving Evelyn standing alone with her thoughts. That night, as Evelyn left the hospital, the rain had cleared, leaving the city streets shining under the glow of the streetlights. Her steps felt lighter than they had in days. She thought of Mark's words, of Carla's steady kindness, and of Andre Peterson, a man who had reminded her of the power she had to make a difference, no matter how broken the world might seem. Her father's voice echoed softly in her mind. You don't get to choose how others see you. You only get to choose who you are. Evelyn knew who she was. She wasn't defined by Henry Whitmore's mistakes, nor was she bound to the anger she felt toward him. She was her father's daughter. She was a healer. As she walked home, she glanced up at the sky. The clouds had parted, and for the first time in days, the stars shone brightly above her. Evelyn took a deep breath, her heart steady. Tomorrow, she would return to Whitmore's bedside. Tomorrow, she would continue to show up, because that's who she was and who she chose to be. The next morning brought a thin blanket of fog over the city. Evelyn stepped off the train and moved through the quiet streets toward the hospital, her mind surprisingly calm. The encounter with Andre Peterson and his son lingered in her thoughts, a small but powerful reminder of the good she was capable of. It was easy sometimes to lose sight of that, under the weight of doubt and disappointment. But as the automatic doors slid open and she entered the hospital lobby, a familiar unease settled over her shoulders, like a heavy coat. The unfinished conversation with Whitmore tugged at her thoughts. I was a coward, he had admitted, and while his words had been honest, they were far from satisfying. She still didn't know the whole story. Her shoes tapped lightly against the floor as she headed toward the ICU. Nurse Carla was there already, updating the patient board at the nurses' station. She turned at the sound of Evelyn's approach, her expression warm as always. "Morning, Dr. Carson." "Morning, Carla." Evelyn paused, studying the patient list. Whitmore's name still sat at the top. His condition hadn't changed overnight. Carla glanced at her, reading Evelyn's face the way only Carla could. "You going in to see him?" Evelyn hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, I need to." "Good," Carla said softly. "Talking to them matters, even when they're like this. You know that." Evelyn offered a faint smile. Carla always seemed to know exactly what to say. Whitmore's room was quiet, the hum of machines the only sound. Evelyn entered softly, careful not to disturb him. He was awake this time, his pale blue eyes fixed on the ceiling. "Good morning, Dr. Whitmore," she said, her voice gentle but professional. His gaze shifted toward her. "Evelyn." She set her clipboard on the bedside table, taking her usual seat beside him. His breathing was labored, but he seemed more aware than he had the day before. "I need to monitor your vitals," Evelyn said, pressing the stethoscope to his chest. The rhythmic beat of his heart echoed in her ears, weaker than it should have been but steady for now. Whitmore watched her, his gaze unblinking. "You've got questions," he rasped after a moment. Evelyn froze, then straightened. "I do," she admitted, meeting his eyes. Whitmore let out a slow, rattling breath. "I told you the truth yesterday. I was a coward. That's all there is to it." "No," Evelyn said quietly but firmly. "There has to be more. You said you walked away. Why? What changed?" Whitmore's gaze grew distant. For a long time, he said nothing, and Evelyn wondered if he would answer at all. Finally, he spoke, his voice soft, almost fragile. "I didn't realize what they were when I joined," he said. "At first, it was just doctors' men I admired, men who promised success, connections. I was young and ambitious, Evelyn. I wanted to be someone." Evelyn listened, her heart pounding. "But then I started seeing it for what it was. The exclusion, the quiet comments behind closed doors. And I—" His voice cracked, and he turned his head slightly away. "I stayed silent for too long. I didn't challenge them. I didn't stand up when I should have. But there was a moment, one patient, that changed everything." "What happened?" Evelyn asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Whitmore's gaze softened. "A boy came into the clinic. He was black, 12 years old. A bad infection, something that could have been treated easily if he had been seen sooner, but they wouldn't let him through the door. They said his family could go somewhere else, and I let it happen. Evelyn felt her breath catch in her throat. Whitmore closed his eyes. The boy died. I never forgot his face, Evelyn, or the look in his mother's eyes. That's when I knew I couldn't stay. I left the group, but I never spoke out. Maybe I was afraid they'd ruin me, or maybe I just didn't want to face what I'd been part of. Either way, I carried it with me, every day. The silence that followed was deafening. Evelyn stared at him, her emotions tangled into knots she couldn't begin to untie. Anger, pity, grief, they all swirled together. You could have done more, she said finally. You should have done more. Whitmore opened his eyes, and they looked smaller somehow, less sharp than they had ever been. You're right, he said. I could have, but I didn't. And that's my burden to bear. Evelyn looked away, her fingers curling tightly in her lap. How do you forgive something like that? She wondered. Why did you help me? She asked suddenly. All those years ago you pushed me, encouraged me, believed in me when no one else did. Why? Whitmore's gaze met hers. Because you deserved it, he whispered. Because I saw in you everything I couldn't be: courage, resilience. I wanted to help you become the doctor I never was. Evelyn swallowed hard, her throat tight. The words hung between them, heavy and raw. She had spent so many years building her life on the foundation of Whitmore's belief in her. Now, that foundation felt cracked, but somehow it still stood. I don't know if I can forgive you, she admitted quietly. I wouldn't expect you to, Whitmore replied. But I hope you keep doing what you do, because you're better than I ever was, Evelyn. You're everything I hoped you'd become. Evelyn stared at him, his face pale against the pillow. She thought of her father's words again. You only get to choose who you are. I'll be back later, she said softly, standing up. Whitmore's eyes closed, and his breathing evened out as he drifted to sleep. Evelyn spent the rest of the day immersed in her work. Patience needed her, and that steady rhythm of responsibility was the only thing that kept her from spiraling into her thoughts. It wasn't until the sun had begun to set that Evelyn took a moment to breathe. She sat in the staff lounge with Carla, the two of them sharing a quiet cup of tea. You look like you're carrying the world on your shoulders, Carla said softly, breaking the silence. Evelyn let out a small sigh. Sometimes it feels like it. Carla studied her for a moment before speaking. You know, I worked under Whitmore too back in the day. He was hard on everyone, demanded perfection, but he believed in you from the start. I could see it. Evelyn looked down at her cup. He's not who I thought he was, Carla. I don't know how to accept that. Carla reached across the table, resting her hand gently on Evelyn's. People are complicated, Evelyn. You don't have to forgive him, but you can still learn from him. You can be better because of him, not for his sake, but for yours. Evelyn blinked, surprised by the sudden sting of tears in her eyes. Carla's kindness settled something deep within her, an understanding that healing, like forgiveness, wasn't linear. Thank you, Evelyn whispered. Any time, Carla replied with a small smile. You've got this. That night, as Evelyn walked home, she felt the weight of the day pressing on her shoulders. But as she looked up at the city skyline, she realized something had shifted. Whitmore's past would never sit right with her. It wasn't something that could be explained away or forgotten, but she could still honor the lessons he had taught her and let those lessons shape her into something better. Evelyn paused outside her apartment building, glancing up at the stars peeking through the clouds. You get to choose who you are, she reminded herself, and she would choose to keep showing up, to keep healing, to keep pushing forward. Tomorrow, she would face Whitmore again, and whatever came next, she would face it head on. The ICU was still as Evelyn walked down its dimly lit corridor, the rhythmic beeping of machines echoing faintly. Outside, the rain had returned, tapping softly against the windows like a quiet metronome. It was a fitting backdrop, she thought, for the heaviness in her chest. She had spent the night replaying Whitmore's confession, trying to make sense of it. Her anger still simmered, but there was something else beneath it now, something harder to name. Perhaps it was grief, not for Whitmore himself, but for the idealized version of him she had held on to for so long. As she approached his room, she found herself hesitating at the door. The man inside was no longer the unwavering mentor she had placed on a pedestal. He was flawed, fragile, and broken by his own choices. Yet he had believed in her, encouraged her to fight when others doubted her. Evelyn still didn't know how to reconcile those truths, but she was done running from them. Taking a deep breath, she stepped inside. Dr. Whitmore was awake, though barely. The lines on his face were deeper today, as though the weight of their conversation had etched itself into his skin. His breaths were labored, each one sounding like a small struggle. "Evelyn," he rasped, his voice thin. Evelyn took her usual seat beside him. "Good morning, Dr. Whitmore." He turned his head slightly toward her, his pale blue eyes dim but aware. "You're still here." "I told you I would be," she replied softly. He managed a faint, almost wistful smile. "Stubborn as ever." "I learned from the best," Evelyn said. The words surprised her gentler than she expected them to be. Whitmore's smile faded, and he stared at the ceiling for a long moment. The silence stretched between them, heavy but not hostile. Evelyn let it linger, waiting for him to speak. Finally, he said, "You're angry with me." Evelyn didn't flinch. "I am." Whitmore nodded faintly. "You should be." Evelyn studied him, her hands folded tightly in her lap. "You said you walked away. You said you spent your life trying to make up for it. But did you ever face it? Did you ever tell anyone?" Whitmore's eyes drifted closed, his expression tightening as though her words stung. "No," he admitted softly. "I buried it, Evelyn. I buried it because I was ashamed, because I thought that if I did enough good, it might wash away the stain." Evelyn frowned. "Did it?" His gaze met hers again, and she saw the depth of his regret. "No, it never does." For a moment, Evelyn didn't know what to say. There was something deeply unsettling about watching a man like Henry Whitmore, a man she had once believed to be unshakable, laid bare by his own guilt. "You can't erase the harm," Evelyn said finally, her voice steady. "But you could have done more. You should have done more." "I know," Whitmore whispered, his voice breaking, "and that will haunt me until my last breath." Evelyn looked away, the ache in her chest sharp and unrelenting. She wanted to tell him that it wasn't enough, that no amount of guilt could undo what had been done. But she also couldn't ignore the man lying before her. His regret wasn't performative. It was real, carved into every tired line on his face. "I don't know if I can forgive you," Evelyn said quietly. "Maybe someday. Maybe not." Whitmore's expression softened. "I wouldn't ask you to. Forgiveness is for you, not for me." Evelyn nodded faintly. She understood that much. Her anger was justified, but holding on to it forever wouldn't heal the past or change the future. The room fell silent again, except for the hiss of the ventilator and the rain tapping against the window. Evelyn turned her attention to his IV, adjusting the drip out of habit. When she glanced back at Whitmore, she saw his eyelids fluttering closed, his breathing evening out as sleep overtook him. She sat there for a while longer, watching him. He looked so small now, swallowed up by the hospital bed, and she couldn't help but think of how time leveled everyone in the end. By late afternoon, Evelyn found herself in the hospital cafeteria, a cup of lukewarm tea growing cold in her hands. Mark slid into the seat across from her, his expression lighter than usual. "You're hiding again," he said, teasing gently. Evelyn shook her head. "Not hiding. Just processing. Mark studied her for a moment, his tone softening. How's Whitmore? Fading, Evelyn replied. Slowly, but it's happening. Mark nodded thoughtfully. And you, how are you doing with all of this? Evelyn stared at the tea, her fingers tracing the rim of the cup. I don't know, she admitted. It's hard. He did terrible things, things I can't ignore. But he also did good. For me, for so many patients. I don't know how to balance those truths. Mark leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. You don't have to. Not yet, anyway. Life isn't a ledger, Evelyn. You can't tally up someone's good and bad and come up with a simple answer. People are messy. All you can do is decide what you want to take from it. Evelyn looked up at him, surprised by the wisdom in his words. How'd you get so insightful? Mark grinned. I listen to a lot of podcasts. Evelyn rolled her eyes, but the tension in her chest eased slightly. She appreciated Mark's ability to cut through the noise without minimizing what she was feeling. You're not alone in this, you know, he added after a moment. You've got people here who care about you, who see you for the incredible doctor you are. Evelyn felt her throat tighten, and she nodded. Thanks, Mark. Anytime, he said with a grin. Now go save lives. I'll take care of the caffeine supply. That evening, Evelyn stood at her desk, staring at a single photograph she had tucked into one of her old notebooks. It was from her residency graduation, a candid shot of her standing next to Whitmore, her smile radiant, his expression one of quiet pride. She picked it up, running her thumb over the edge of the photo. The man beside her in that picture wasn't perfect. He had made mistakes, unforgivable ones, but he had also been the first to see her potential. She wasn't ready to let go of her anger, but she also couldn't deny the truth of what he had given her. Evelyn tucked the photo back into the notebook and exhaled slowly. Tomorrow would come, and she would face it, because that's who she was, a healer, a fighter, someone who showed up even when it was hard. As she left her office, Evelyn glanced back at the quiet hospital corridors, a faint sense of calm settling over her. She didn't have all the answers, but maybe that was okay. Maybe understanding came slowly, one day at a time. Later that night, as Evelyn lay in bed, the rain tapped gently against her window. She stared at the ceiling, her father's words echoing softly in her mind. You don't get to choose how others see you. You only get to choose who you are. Evelyn closed her eyes, her breathing steady. Tomorrow, she would choose to be better, not because of Whitmore, but because of herself. The storm outside passed on, leaving the world just a little quieter. The ICU was quiet when Evelyn entered the next morning, save for the rhythmic hum of machines and the soft footsteps of nurses moving about. The air in Whitmore's room felt colder today, sharper. Evelyn stood at the doorway for a moment, steeling herself before stepping inside. She had spent the night wrestling with her emotions, her anger at Whitmore's past, her grief at seeing him so frail, and the realization that no clear answers would ever come. Whitmore was awake when she approached, though his breathing was shallow and ragged. His face looked smaller than before, the skin more sunken beneath the weight of illness. Evelyn's heart ached despite herself. "Good morning," she said softly, pulling up the stool beside his bed. Whitmore's pale eyes turned toward her, and for a fleeting moment, the faintest ghost of a smile tugged at the corners of his lips. "You came back," he rasped. "I said I would," Evelyn replied, adjusting the blanket around him. "I'm here." He didn't answer, but his eyes held hers, the weight of unspoken words filling the room. Evelyn checked his vitals. His oxygen levels were low, his pulse weak, and scribbled the numbers onto her chart. She didn't want to say it aloud, but she knew he was fading fast. "How are you feeling?" she asked quietly. "Like an old man," Whitmore muttered, though the humor was faint. Evelyn glanced at the monitor, watching his heartbeat spike and dip unevenly. Not much time, she thought grimly. Whitmore turned his gaze back toward her. Evelyn, there's something you should know. Evelyn froze, her pen hovering over the chart. What is it? His breathing hitched, as if the words were caught in his chest. You were always more than I deserved, he murmured. I failed so many. But you were different. You were my redemption, even if you didn't know it. Evelyn stared at him, the rawness in his voice cutting through her like glass. Redemption? She repeated, her tone sharper than she intended. You think you earned redemption because you mentored me, because you helped one person while others suffered? Whitmore flinched slightly, his face shadowed with shame. No, that's not what I meant. Evelyn's voice softened, though the edge of her anger remained. I'm not your redemption. That's not mine to carry. You don't get to erase the harm you caused just because you helped me. I know, Whitmore whispered, his voice barely audible now. But you were the good I clung to. The proof that maybe I wasn't all bad. Evelyn looked at him for a long moment, her chest tight. She wanted to deny him any solace, to hold on to the anger that still burned in her. And yet, she saw the truth in his eyes. He wasn't asking for forgiveness. He wasn't asking her to fix what he had broken. He was simply confessing, offering up his regret like a man setting down a burden too heavy to bear any longer. I don't know if I can forgive you, she admitted again. But I'm still here, and I'm still listening. Whitmore closed his eyes, a shuddering breath escaping him. For a moment, Evelyn thought he might say more, but the room fell silent except for the steady hiss of the ventilator. The day passed in a blur of patient charts, rounds, and quiet reflection. Evelyn tried to focus on her work, but Whitmore's words followed her like shadows. In the afternoon, she found herself standing in front of a conference room window, staring out at the rain-slicked city below. The hospital felt quieter than usual, as if it, too, sensed that something was coming to an end. Evelyn? She turned to find Nurse Carla standing in the doorway. You okay? Evelyn hesitated, then nodded. Just thinking. Carla stepped inside, her expression kind. About him? Evelyn sighed. Yeah. Carla studied her for a moment, then said softly, You're carrying a lot of weight on your shoulders. It's okay to let some of it go. How? Evelyn asked, her voice quieter than she intended. How do I let it go? Carla came closer, folding her arms. By accepting that his choices aren't yours to fix. You don't have to carry his guilt, Evelyn. That's for him to face, not you. Evelyn looked down at the floor. It's not just guilt. It's everything. I admired him, Carla. I built so much of myself on the faith he had in me. And now you're seeing all of him, Carla finished gently. The good, the bad, the broken parts too. And that's hard, Evelyn. But it doesn't take away what you've accomplished. You made it here because of you, not him. Evelyn blinked, the words sinking in slowly. Carla was right. Whitmore had been part of her story, but he wasn't the story. Her achievements, her growth, her perseverance, they belonged to her alone. Thanks, Carla, Evelyn said softly. Carla smiled. Any time, Dr. Carson. Now go take a breath before your next round. You look like you need it. By the time the sun dipped below the skyline, Evelyn returned to the ICU. She stood outside Whitmore's room, watching through the window as the machines pumped air into his failing lungs. He looked even smaller now, the light casting shadows over his worn face. Evelyn stepped inside and took a seat beside him. He was asleep, his breathing uneven, but she spoke anyway. I don't know if I can forgive you, she murmured. Not yet, maybe not ever. But I'm still here, Dr. Whitmore. I'll make sure you're comfortable. I'll do my job, because that's who I am. And maybe someday, I'll figure out the rest. She sat in silence, listening to the sounds of the machines. The anger she had carried for days no longer burned as brightly. It was still there, smoldering beneath the surface, but something else had begun to take its place. Resolve. As Evelyn left the room, she glanced back one last time. Whitmore's face was peaceful in sleep, his expression softened by the dim light. Evelyn stepped outside into the night air, the rain finally gone. The city glistened under streetlights, fresh and new, and for the first time in days, she felt a sense of clarity. She couldn't change the past. She couldn't erase Whitmore's mistakes or carry his guilt. But she could choose how to move forward. Her father's voice echoed in her mind again, steady and sure. You only get to choose who you are. And Evelyn knew exactly who she was. She was a healer, a fighter, a woman who had built her life on strength, resilience, and kindness. As she walked toward the train station, Evelyn tilted her head to the sky. The clouds were clearing, revealing a handful of stars glimmering faintly through the dark. She took a deep breath and let it out slowly, her steps steady, her heart calm. Tomorrow would come, and she would be ready. The morning light filtered through the hospital windows, a thin gray wash that matched Evelyn's mood. She had arrived earlier than usual, slipping into the ICU before most of the day's staff had clocked in. The air was still, the hallways quiet, and for once, Evelyn appreciated the calm. Dr. Whitmore's condition had taken a sharp decline overnight. The nurse's note left on his chart was brief: vitals unstable. Comfort measures in place. Evelyn stood just outside his room, watching him through the glass. He lay still beneath the tangle of wires and tubes, the sound of the ventilator masking the faint, irregular rhythm of his breaths. It was strange to think that this man, once so commanding, so alive, was now so close to the end. What do you say to someone who is running out of time? The thought sat heavy in her chest as she pushed the door open and stepped inside. Whitmore's eyes were closed, and for a moment, Evelyn thought he might have already slipped away. But then his eyelids flickered, and his head turned slightly on the pillow. His gaze found her, faint and distant, but aware. "Evelyn," he whispered. She pulled up the stool and sat beside him, her heart twisting at how weak his voice had become. She checked the monitor. His pulse was threadbare, like the last embers of a dying fire. "Good morning, Dr. Whitmore," she said softly, her voice calm, even though her emotions were not. Whitmore smiled faintly, a fragile gesture that barely touched his lips. "Still here?" he rasped, his breathing uneven. "I said I would be." There was a long pause. The sound of the ventilator filled the room as Whitmore gathered the strength to speak again. "I don't have much time," he said finally, his voice barely more than a breath. "There are things I need to say." Evelyn swallowed, her throat tight. "I'm listening." Whitmore's pale blue eyes studied her, though they were unfocused now, as if he were looking through her and into some distant memory. "You're stronger than I ever was," he murmured. "You carry a weight I could never bear, and you do it with grace." Evelyn looked down, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She didn't know how to respond, so she let him continue. "I spent so much of my life being afraid," Whitmore whispered. "Afraid of what I'd lose, afraid of who I really was. I let others shape me. I let silence define me. And because of that, I caused harm." Evelyn's chest tightened. She wanted to look away, but she couldn't. There was something painfully raw about seeing Whitmore like this, a man confronting the weight of his choices as time slipped through his fingers. "I thought I could fix it," he said, his voice trembling now. "I thought helping you, helping my patients, it would be enough. But guilt doesn't work like that." Evelyn's voice was soft when she finally spoke. "No, it doesn't." Whitmore turned his head slightly toward her, his gaze searching. "But you made me believe in something better, Evelyn. You were my brightest moment, My proof that people can change, that this world can be different. Evelyn's eyes stung, and she blinked quickly, pushing the tears back. She wasn't ready to hear these words, wasn't ready for the finality in them. Dr. Whitmore, she said carefully, you can't undo what's been done, and I can't tell you that what you did for me erases your past. But you were right about one thing: you believed in me when no one else did. And because of that, I'm here. Whitmore's eyes softened, glistening faintly. That's all I wanted, he whispered. To know I didn't fail you. Evelyn exhaled shakily. You didn't fail me, she said finally. I got here on my own. But you helped me see that I could. A silence fell over the room, broken only by the steady hiss of the ventilator. Whitmore's face seemed to relax, as if the words had lifted a weight off his chest. His breathing slowed, though it remained shallow. Evelyn, he whispered again. Yes? There was a pause, as if he were searching for the right words, but when he spoke, his voice was barely audible. You'll be a better doctor than I ever was. A better person? Evelyn looked at him, her heart aching at the finality of his tone. Thank you, she said quietly. Whitmore's eyelids fluttered, and his gaze drifted toward the ceiling. For a moment, Evelyn thought he was slipping away, but then his lips moved one last time. I'm sorry, he whispered, for everything. And then, as the monitors began to slow, his chest fell still. The ventilator hissed for a long moment before falling silent, as though it, too, understood that its work was done. Evelyn stayed seated, watching as the life faded from Henry Whitmore's face. His expression was peaceful now, the lines of regret softened, as if the burden had finally been released. She reached forward and gently placed a hand on his, her fingers trembling slightly. Goodbye, Dr. Whitmore, she whispered. Evelyn stepped out of Whitmore's room and closed the door quietly behind her. The hallway was still, the usual hum of the hospital now muted in her ears. Carla was waiting at the nurse's station, her face filled with quiet understanding. Is he gone? She asked softly. Evelyn nodded. Yeah, he's gone. Carla rested a gentle hand on Evelyn's arm. You okay? Evelyn let out a slow breath, the ache in her chest still sharp, but no longer unbearable. I will be, she said, and she meant it. That evening, Evelyn sat at her small kitchen table, a single cup of tea cooling beside her. The city outside her window was alive with light and sound, but for once, she didn't feel the pull of it. She sat with herself, with her thoughts, and let the silence wrap around her like a blanket. Whitmore's words lingered in her mind. You'll be a better doctor than I ever was. She knew now that forgiveness wasn't about excusing his past or forgetting the harm he had caused. It was about choosing not to let it define her. Whitmore's mistakes were his own, but the lessons he had taught her, the good that had come from their time together, were hers to keep. Evelyn picked up the framed photo of her parents that sat on her table. Her father's words echoed softly in her mind, as they always did. You only get to choose who you are. And she had chosen to show up, to fight for her patients, to carry herself with integrity, even when it was hard. She would build a legacy she could be proud of, one rooted in kindness, resilience, and the determination to make the world better for those who came after her. As Evelyn set the photo back down, a calm settled over her. The past would never be perfect, but the future, her future, was hers to shape. The stars were faint tonight, hidden behind a layer of clouds, but Evelyn smiled faintly as she looked out at the dark sky. Tomorrow would come, and she would be ready. The days following Dr. Whitmore's passing brought a strange quiet to Evelyn's life. The hospital carried on as it always did. Machines hummed, patients arrived, and doctors rushed through hallways, but something in Evelyn felt different, lighter somehow. The storm she had been carrying in her chest had quieted. Not because everything made sense, but because she had finally accepted the pieces that never would. Her shift that morning began like any other. The pale morning light spilled through the ICU windows as Evelyn checked her patient charts. The nurses greeted her with warm smiles, and Mark Patterson waved as he passed, coffee cup in hand as usual. "Hey, Dr. Carson," Nurse Carla called as Evelyn approached the nurses' station. "Someone left something for you." Evelyn frowned. "For me?" Carla handed her a small, slightly worn envelope with her name scrawled on the front in shaky handwriting. "A lawyer dropped it off this morning. Said it was from Dr. Whitmore's estate." Evelyn stared at the envelope, her heart tightening. "Thank you, Carla." Carla gave her a soft pat on the arm before returning to her work, leaving Evelyn alone at the corner desk. For a moment, she just held the envelope, running her thumb along its edges. She hadn't expected this not from him. Swallowing hard, she finally slid her finger under the seal and unfolded the letter inside. The paper trembled slightly in her hands as she began to read. "Dear Evelyn, if you're reading this, I'm gone. And there are things I never had the courage to say while I was still alive. I won't ask for forgiveness. I know that what I did, the harm I allowed, the silence I kept, will always be part of my story. You were right to be angry. I have carried that same anger toward myself for years. But I need you to know this. You were my brightest light. Watching you grow, watching you fight to claim a space in this world, gave me hope I didn't deserve to have. I cannot undo my past, but through you, I saw the possibility of a better future. One I knew you would build, with or without me. I'm leaving you something, a scholarship fund in your name, to help young doctors who, like you, have the talent and drive, but not the opportunities. Use it to lift others the way you lifted yourself. Make the world better than I left it. You are everything I wasn't, and for that, I am grateful. Henry Whitmore. Evelyn's eyes blurred as she reached the bottom of the page. She folded the letter carefully and set it down, her hands shaking. A scholarship funds, in my name. The weight of what he had done, of his final attempt at redemption, settled in her chest. She didn't know whether to feel gratitude, sorrow, or anger all over again. Perhaps it was all three, but as the initial wave of emotion passed, a quiet realization took its place. Whitmore had given her one last lesson, not in words, but in action. People could not rewrite their pasts, but they could choose what to leave behind. And this fund, this opportunity for others, was his choice. By late afternoon, Evelyn sat in her office, the letter spread on her desk like a fragile relic. Mark walked in without knocking, as he often did, a curious look on his face. "You look like you've seen a ghost," he teased, though his tone softened when he saw her expression. "What's going on?" Evelyn slid the letter toward him. "It's from Whitmore." Mark frowned as he scanned the page, his face unreadable. When he finished, he let out a low whistle and handed it back to her. "A scholarship fund in your name? That's something." Evelyn nodded. "It is. How do you feel about it?" "I don't know," she admitted. "He can't undo the harm he caused, but maybe it's something good, something that can help others." Mark studied her for a moment, then smiled faintly. "Well, if anyone deserves to have a scholarship in their name, it's you. Think about what this will mean for people, Ev. The doors it will open." Evelyn leaned back in her chair, staring at the letter again. "It doesn't erase his past." "No," Mark agreed. "But maybe it's not about erasing. Maybe it's about planting something new." Evelyn exhaled slowly, the weight on her chest easing just a little more. "Yeah," she murmured, "maybe it is." The weeks turned into months, and life at the hospital moved forward. Evelyn returned to her routine, carrying herself with the same quiet determination that had brought her this far. But something in her had shifted an understanding, a peace she hadn't known she needed. Word about the scholarship spread quickly, and with it came a flood of applications. young medical students from underrepresented communities, many of whom reminded Evelyn of herself, submitted their hopes and dreams on paper. Evelyn read every application personally, determined to honor the fund the way it was intended. One afternoon, as she sat in her office reviewing the latest batch of applications, Carla knocked gently on the door. "Got a minute?" "Of course," Evelyn replied, setting her papers aside. Carla stepped in, holding a small envelope. "This came in today. I thought you might want to see it." Evelyn opened the envelope and pulled out a handwritten note. "Dr. Carson, I wanted to thank you for creating this opportunity. I thought about quitting med school so many times, but this scholarship gives me hope. It reminds me that people like me do belong in medicine. I won't let you down. Maya Simmons." Evelyn stared at the note, a lump forming in her throat. Carla watched her quietly, a knowing smile on her face. "You're changing lives, Evelyn," Carla said softly. Evelyn swallowed hard, nodding. "I hope so." Carla tilted her head. "Whitmore might have started this, but you're the one carrying it forward. You're the legacy now." Evelyn looked up, the truth of those words settling deep within her. Whitmore's story had ended, but hers was still unfolding. She had the power to shape it, to turn pain into progress, mistakes into meaning. Months later, Evelyn stood at a podium in a crowded auditorium, looking out at rows of young faces. She had been invited to speak at the ceremony announcing the first recipients of the Whitmore Carson Scholarship Fund. She glanced down at her notes, then back at the crowd. "When I started my journey in medicine," she began, her voice calm and steady, "there were people who doubted me, people who believed that someone like me didn't belong here. But there were also those who saw my potential and pushed me to keep going." She paused, her gaze sweeping the room. "This scholarship exists because every single one of you deserves a chance to be here, to be seen, to be heard, and to change the world for the better. It's not about where you come from. It's about where you choose to go." The audience erupted into applause, and Evelyn stepped back from the podium, a faint smile tugging at her lips. In the crowd, she spotted Nurse Carla and Mark, both beaming with pride. As Evelyn walked off stage, she felt something new settle in her chest, a sense of purpose that no longer carried the weight of Whitmore's shadow. He had been part of her story, but the future was hers alone to write. That night, as Evelyn walked home through the city streets, the sky was clear and full of stars. She tilted her head back, her father's words echoing softly in her mind. "You only get to choose who you are." Evelyn smiled faintly, her steps light against the pavement. And she knew who she was: a healer, a mentor, and a woman building something better. A year later, Evelyn stood in her small office, the soft afternoon light filtering through the window. The sound of footsteps and laughter echoed faintly from the hallway as residents and nurses moved about the busy hospital. On her desk, beside a stack of patient charts, sat a framed photograph of the first group of scholarship recipients, young doctors, diverse and full of potential, smiling brightly at the camera. Evelyn's eyes lingered on the photo, pride swelling in her chest. She thought of Whitmore, of the complex legacy he had left behind. He hadn't been perfect, far from it, but the future he had glimpsed in her had become something real, something alive. A soft knock at her door pulled her from her thoughts. "Dr. Carson?" It was Maya Simmons, one of the scholarship recipients, standing in the doorway in her scrubs. Her nervous smile reminded Evelyn of herself years ago. "I just wanted to say, thank you," Maya said, "for believing in us, for giving us this chance." Evelyn stood, her smile warm and steady. "You don't have to thank me, Maya. Just do the same for someone else someday. That's how we build something better." Maya nodded, her expression determined. "I will, Dr. Carson. I promise." As Maya left, Evelyn sat back down, the faint hum of the hospital wrapping around her like a familiar comfort. She picked up the photograph again, holding it carefully in her hands. "This is just the beginning," she thought. and it's worth every step. She turned to glance out the window, where the evening sun dipped low on the horizon, casting golden light across the city she served. Tomorrow would bring more challenges, more lives to heal, and more chances to make a difference. And Evelyn would show up for it all, because that's who she was. Thank you for joining us on Evelyn's journey, a story of resilience, redemption, and choosing to build a better future. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more heartfelt, thoughtful narratives like this one, don't forget to like this video, leave a comment, and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us share more stories that inspire hope, kindness, and perseverance. Subscribe now and become part of a community that believes in the power of storytelling to change perspectives and lives. We'll see you in the next story.